I never planned to come back here. 15 years was long enough to forget the sound of the wind scraping across these empty hills, or the way the pines whispered like ghosts when the sun went down. But life has a strange way of calling you home when you least expect it. This morning I packed up my truck, loaded my 2 dogs, Atlas, my loyal German shepherd, and Luna, a restless husky with eyes like cold fire, and started driving north. I told myself it was just to settle the past, to clean out what was left of my father's house. But deep down, I knew something else was waiting for me. My name is Jonas Keene. I served half my life wearing a uniform, and the other half trying to forget why. Atlas and Luna are the only family I've got left, their silence steadier than any man's words. People like us don't go looking for adventure anymore, but somehow, it keeps finding us. By the time I reached the old property, fog had swallowed the tree line. The house stood there on the ridge, gray and bent from years of salt wind, a ghost of timber and memory. I stepped out, boots crunching on gravel, and the air smelled of rain, iron, and something older like secrets. Atlas went stiff beside me. Luna growled low, her ears tilting toward the cellar door that creaked in the wind. I told myself it was nothing, just the house breathing, just the past stirring. But I was wrong. Today I want you to come with me. Me, Atlas, and Luna, as we uncover what's been buried beneath this ground for decades. Because somewhere under these rotten floorboards, something is waiting, and it's been waiting for me all along. The road that led to my father's house hadn't changed much, narrow, winding, half swallowed by pine roots and fog. But to me it felt smaller than I remembered, like time had been eating away at it bite by bite. The headlights cut through the mist, revealing flashes of the old wooden guardrails and the rusted mile markers that hadn't seen fresh paint in decades. Atlas leaned forward in the passenger seat, nose twitching at the smell of the sea, while Luna paced restlessly behind us, her claws tapping a soft rhythm against the floorboard. The GPS had long since lost signal, but I didn't need directions. My body knew the way, even if my mind wished it didn't. Every turn was a muscle memory, every rise and dip a familiar ache in the chest. The road curved sharply left, and there it was, the bluff. The house sat on top of it, like an exhausted sentinel looking out over the gray Atlantic. I slowed the truck and let the engine idle. For a long moment I didn't move. The waves crashed far below, and the wind carried the sharp tang of salt and rot. The house hadn't been painted since I was a boy. Its white boards were now a dull, weather-beaten gray. The porch sagged slightly in the middle, and one of the shutters banged loosely against the side of the house, creaking like an old hinge in a coffin. Atlas whined softly. Luna tilted her head, letting out a short, impatient bark, as if to say, "It's time." I stepped out. Gravel crunched beneath my boots. The air was cold enough to bite through my jacket, the kind of cold that carried memories with it. I could almost hear my father's voice in that wind, not his words, but his silence. That steady, heavy quiet that filled the house after my mother died. Inside the truck bed sat a small wooden box, the urn that held his ashes. It was strange being the one to bring him home again, after spending half my life trying to get away from him. I picked it up carefully, cradling it in my arm like it was something alive. "Come on," I murmured to the dogs. Atlas trotted ahead, tail low, scanning the ground like a soldier entering enemy territory. Luna stayed closer to me, her breath leaving little clouds in the air. The key was still under the loose stone by the porch. Some habits never die. The metal was cold, rough with rust, but it turned easily in the lock. When the door opened, a gust of stale air greeted me, dust, damp wood, and the faint scent of oil. It was like stepping into a room that had been holding its breath for years. I stood in the entryway for a while, letting my eyes adjust. The light filtering through the grimy windows was thin and gray like smoke. Everything was exactly as I remembered. The coat rack by the door still held my father's old jacket, the same one he wore every time he went fishing. The clock on the wall had stopped at 2:14, its second hand frozen mid-tick. The armchair faced the fireplace, like it always had, waiting for an occupant who would never return. Atlas sniffed along the baseboards. Luna went straight to the fireplace and lay down beside it, her blue eyes reflecting the dying light. I lowered the urn onto the mantel. The wood groaned faintly under its weight, as though the house itself recognized who had come back. I took a slow walk through the rooms. Each step sounded too loud. The floorboards creaked under me, echoing like heartbeats in an empty chest. The kitchen smelled of old salt and iron. The table was still covered with faint burn marks from the soldering iron my father used when he was repairing tools. On the counter sat a half-empty tin of coffee grounds hardened with time, 15 years. And yet somehow the air still felt thick with his presence. When I left this house, I'd been 20, angry and sure of myself. I'd joined the army 3 days after our last argument. I still remember that night, the way the rain slammed against the windows, the smell of wet wood, and his voice, low and sharp. We hadn't shouted. We didn't need to. The silence between us did the shouting for us. "You're just like your mother," he'd said finally. It was meant as an insult, but I took it as a warning. After that, we stopped being father and son. We became strangers who shared the same name. Now, walking through the ruins of his life, I realized how much I'd built mine in reaction to his. The discipline, the stoicism, the refusal to talk about what hurt, it was all him mirrored in me. I had become the very man I swore I'd never be. I found myself standing in front of the window, overlooking the cliffs. The glass was cracked at the corner, and through it I could see the restless sea. The tide was rising, curling white and violent against the rocks below. Somewhere out there my father's boat had once drifted, hauling nets heavy with fish and salt. He'd spent more time at sea than he ever had with me. I used to wait for the beam of his lantern, watching from this very window when I was a kid. Every night, that flicker of light told me he was still out there. But one stormy night, the light didn't come back. That was the night I stopped waiting. Atlas nudged my leg, breaking my reverie. He had found a spot on the floor near the old workbench, one of the boards slightly raised. He pawed at it once, then twice, whining softly. "Not now, boy," I muttered. "We'll check it later." He tilted his head, unconvinced, but obeyed. Luna gave a short huff from across the room, curling up tighter, her tail covering her nose. I sat down in the armchair. The springs creaked beneath my weight. From here I could see the whole room, every ghost that still lived in it. My father's toolbox sat half open under the table. His reading glasses rested on a folded newspaper dated the week I left for basic training. The headline read, "Storm expected to hit coast fishermen, warned to stay ashore." I remember that storm. I remember him going out anyway. My hand drifted to the scar across my forearm, a jagged line earned years later in a place far from here. Funny how pain always circles back to where it began. The wind outside rose, whistling through the cracks in the walls. It sounded almost like a voice calling my name. Atlas lifted his head, ears twitching. Luna growled low, her eyes fixed on the hallway that led to the basement stairs. I glanced in that direction, and for the briefest second I thought I saw movement, a shadow retreating into the darkness. My heart skipped, but I brushed it off. Probably the light shifting, or maybe just my mind dredging up things best left buried. Still, the weight of the house pressed down on me. Every object here was a reminder, a trigger. The photograph on the mantel, my mother standing in front of the boat, smiling at something beyond the frame. I could never remember what made her laugh that day. I wanted to believe this return was just about closure. Scatter the ashes, lock the door, and leave. But the longer I stood here, the more it felt like the house wasn't done with me. Like it had been waiting, holding its breath, guarding something. Atlas paced again, uneasy. His nails clicked on the wood. Luna's tail thumped once, twice, and then she went, still ears up, eyes locked on the same dark hallway. That's when I realized the silence of this place wasn't empty at all. It was listening. I took a deep breath, the air thick with dust and memory. "All right," I said quietly, though I wasn't sure who I was talking to, my father, the dogs, or the house itself. "Let's get through this." I spent the rest of the afternoon sorting through boxes, old tools, papers, broken clocks. The dogs followed me from room to room, keeping close. Every drawer I opened was another small wound reopened. letters unsent, receipts from repairs he'd made for neighbors, an old photograph of me holding a fishing rod, smiling proudly, while he stood behind me, face half in shadow. I'd forgotten that picture existed. By dusk, the house had grown colder. The last streaks of daylight turned the windows into mirrors. My reflection looked older than I felt. Eyes tired, hair streaked with gray. I saw my father in that reflection, and it unsettled me more than the shadows ever could. The urn sat quietly on the mantel, watching. I poured myself a glass of whiskey I'd found in the cupboard, dusty half full, and raised it in his direction. To unfinished conversations I whispered. The glass clinked softly against the mantel, and somewhere beneath the floorboards something creaked in reply. Atlas barked once. Luna stood, her fur bristling. I turned toward the hallway again. The basement door stood slightly ajar, though I could have sworn I'd left it closed. That was when the smell hit me. Faint, earthy, like old sawdust and pine resin. A scent I hadn't smelled in years. My father's scent. It drifted from below, from the darkness that led under the house. I stared at that narrow doorway for a long time, my pulse steady but heavy. Maybe it was just the past, exhaling one last ghost, sighing through the cracks. Or maybe, just maybe, something was waiting down there. Atlas growled low. Luna's tail lowered to the ground. I told myself it was nothing, just the house settling, just time playing tricks. But I knew better. Because some silences don't fade with time, they wait. And tonight, in my father's house, that silence had just begun to stir. The night settled heavy over the house, thicker than I remembered. By the time the last light died behind the ridge, the world outside had vanished into fog. I built a small fire in the old stone hearth, not because I needed warmth, but because I couldn't stand the silence. The flames cracked softly, their light flickering against the walls like restless memories. Atlas lay near the door, head on his paws, but eyes open, ever alert. Luna curled beside the armchair, her fur glowing faintly orange in the firelight. For a while it almost felt peaceful. Almost. But then that sound came again. A soft thud, muted, rhythmic, coming from beneath the floorboards. Not loud, not frantic, just steady. At first I ignored it. Old houses make noise. Wood expands, wind pushes, nails shift. I told myself I'd been gone too long, that I'd forgotten the language of this place. But Atlas lifted his head immediately, ears pricked forward. Luna's nose twitched. She gave a low whine that vibrated through the room. I set my glass down and listened. The sound stopped. Silence again. Maybe it was a mouse. Maybe a raccoon got trapped somewhere under the porch. Still, my skin prickled. I forced a laugh to break the tension. "Relax," I said to them, though it sounded like I was trying to convince myself. Just an old house breathing. Atlas didn't move. His gaze fixed on the hallway that led to the basement door. Luna stood pacing in a tight circle before trotting to join him. The fire cracked sharply. One of the logs split, showering sparks across the stone. Both dogs flinched, but didn't turn away from the hall. "All right," I sighed. "You win." I grabbed the flashlight from the mantel and walked toward the noise. The air grew colder with each step, like the house itself was exhaling. The dogs followed close behind, their nails clicking softly on the floor. The basement door hung slightly open again, just as it had earlier. The hinges groaned faintly as I touched it. I shone the light down the narrow stairwell. Only blackness stared back. Dust floated through the beam like snow. The smell came next. Not decay, not mold, but something older, like oil and sawdust. Familiar. My father's scent. It twisted my stomach in a way I couldn't explain. I hesitated at the top step. The last time I'd gone down there, I'd been 17. My father had caught me snooping around his workbench, and I still remembered the sting of his voice when he told me never to enter that place again. "What's mine stays mine, Jonas. Some doors aren't meant to be opened." He never explained what he meant, and I never asked. Now that door stood open, daring me. Atlas growled low and uncertain. Luna leaned forward, sniffing the airtail stiff. Something inside me wanted to shut the door and walk away. To drive into town, find a cheap motel, and pretend this night never happened. But another part of me, the part that had survived too many battlefields to count, refused to back down. I took one step down. The wood groaned beneath my boot. Another step. The cold deepened, swallowing the light. I could hear the faint drip of water somewhere below, slow and rhythmic. Halfway down, the flashlight flickered. "Not now," I muttered, tapping it against my palm. It steadied for a moment, then dimmed again. Atlas barked once, short, sharp. Luna answered with a low growl. I froze. From the bottom of the stairs came another sound, a faint metallic clink, like a chain shifting under weight. Then silence. I swept the beam across the floor. Nothing. Only dust and the vague outline of the old furnace. But then I saw it, a faint line etched into the far wall. A seam where there shouldn't have been one. My pulse quickened. It looked like the edge of a door, small, square, and perfectly fitted to the wall. I stepped closer. The dog stayed at the threshold, unwilling to follow. The air here was different, still almost charged. I brushed the dust away with my sleeve. The outline became clearer, a panel of wood, its grain darker than the rest. Near the corner, half hidden, was a small metal ring. I knelt down, hesitating. Every instinct in me screamed to leave it alone. But my hand moved anyway. I grabbed the ring and pulled. At first, nothing happened. Then, with a dull crack, the panel shifted. Dust rained down. The smell of old pine filled the air, sharp, sweet, and haunting. Behind the panel was darkness, dense, deep, absolute. I shone the flashlight inside. For a heartbeat, I saw nothing but empty air. Then the beam caught something, a glint of glass, a table, the curve of a wooden chair. A room, hidden behind the wall. Atlas barked again, louder this time. Luna pressed against my leg, whining, her body trembling. "It's all right," I whispered, though my throat was dry. "It's just a room." But the truth was, I didn't believe that. The air coming from inside wasn't cold, it was still warm, like someone had been there not long ago. The dust around the edges was disturbed, faint footprints leading inward. Footprints that weren't mine. I felt my heartbeat slow into a heavy rhythm. The flashlight trembled slightly in my hand. I'd thought I came back to bury the past, to close a chapter. But standing there, staring into that hidden darkness, I realized something had been waiting all along. The dogs wouldn't move closer. Atlas barked once more, then backed up, teeth bared, his eyes fixed on the void. Luna pressed tighter against me, whining in a tone that sounded almost like a plea. I looked down at them, at their fear. Then back at the hidden doorway, yawning open like a wound. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was guilt. Or maybe, after years of running from ghosts, I was ready to meet one. Either way, I stepped forward. The air shifted, thick with the smell of oil, salt, and thyme. My flashlight flickered again, but I didn't stop. Whatever waited beyond that door wasn't going to stay buried forever. And neither was I. The moment I crossed the threshold, the air changed. It was heavier, denser, like the air at the bottom of the sea holding its breath for centuries. My flashlight beam cut through the dust, catching fragments of floating wood shavings that shimmered like ghosts in midair. Atlas growled softly behind me, but neither he nor Luna dared to follow. I was on my own now. The hidden room was small, maybe the size of a tool shed, but the ceiling was high, lost in shadow. Every wall was lined with shelves, carefully built, precise. The work of a craftsman who had loved his craft too much to let anyone else touch it. On those shelves sat dozens of wooden pieces, half-finished carvings, models, tools arranged with military precision. My father's handwriting marked each one in chalk measurements, notes, dates. The latest was 15 years ago, the year I left. The air smelled of pine oil varnish and something faintly metallic. The smell of him. I ran my hand across one of the benches. A layer of fine dust coated my fingers, but beneath it, the wood was smooth, recently sanded, maybe even used. My heart started to thud. That didn't make sense. No one had lived here since he died. On the far wall hung his old overcoat, the same one I remembered from the night he told me never to come down here. The sleeves were stiff, the collar frayed. I reached for it, and something fell from the pocket. A small metal key. It hit the floor with a faint chime. I bent down, picked it up, and turned it in my palm. It was an old skeleton key, brass, cold as ice. I didn't recognize it. Behind me, the house creaked. It sounded almost like footsteps above. I froze, listening. The wind outside howled through the chimney and the sound echoed faintly through the hidden room. For a moment it almost felt like the house was alive, breathing, whispering, warning. I turned back toward the shelves. At the far end of the workbench sat something different, a wooden box covered by a canvas cloth. My father had been meticulous. He never left his projects uncovered. I reached forward and lifted the cloth. The box was small, about the size of a shoebox, made from dark walnut and sealed with brass hinges. The surface was engraved with patterns of waves and stars, symbols he used to carve when I was a kid. But one thing stood out, a carved name along the top edge. My name. I traced the letters slowly, my breath catching. Jonas Keene. He'd made this for me. But why hide it? The box had a lock, the keyhole, small, circular, and unfamiliar. I looked down at the skeleton key in my hand. For a moment I hesitated. Then I slid it in. It fit perfectly. A click. The lid creaked open. Inside was a collection of objects wrapped in yellowed parchment. A faint smell of tobacco and salt drifted up. I peeled the paper back carefully. There was a pocket knife, its handle worn smooth by years of use. A compass with the glass cracked but still pointing north. And beneath them, folded with care, a letter. I unfolded it. The paper trembled in my hands, not from age but from me. If you ever find this, son, it means I never got the chance to say what I should have said a long time ago. I stopped breathing. The handwriting was his. Strong, deliberate, but shaky at the edges. I wasn't good at speaking. Your mother was the voice of this house. I was only the silence. When she died, I didn't know how to fill that silence. So I built things instead. Things that couldn't talk back. Things that couldn't leave. My throat tightened. I could almost hear him saying it. His low gravel voice echoing from the corners of the room. You left because of me, and I don't blame you. You needed to live. I only ask that you forgive me for the way I tried to love you, by control, by rules, by distance. I never hated you, Jonas. I was just afraid you'd become me. The last line was smudged, as if his hand had shaken or he'd spilled something over it. If you're reading this, finish what I started. There's one more thing you need to see. Look beneath the bench. I lowered the letter, heart pounding. Slowly I knelt and shone the flashlight under the workbench. There it was, a square metal plate, set into the floorboards, with a small indentation shaped like a keyhole, the same shape as the brass key. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, almost electric. Atlas barked from the doorway, sharp and anxious. Luna let out a long, low whine. I know, I whispered to them. I feel it too. I fit the key into the slot and turned. A deep click echoed through the wood. The panel shifted slightly, revealing a shallow compartment underneath. Inside lay a single object, a journal, bound in cracked leather, its spine held together by twine. I lifted it out carefully. The cover bore no title, just a carved emblem of a ship. His ship, the Mara's Lantern, the one that had vanished in the storm years ago. When I opened it, the smell of the sea hit me hard. Pages upon pages filled with notes, diagrams, coordinates, and drawings, records of every voyage, every repair, every storm survived. But the last few pages were different. The ink was darker, fresher. He'd been writing until the very end. And the last entry wasn't about the sea. There are things I can't undo. The debts, the silence, the lies. If Jonas ever returns, tell him the truth is buried not at sea, but here, under the house, where the storm never reaches. The light flickered again. A chill rippled through the air. For a moment I thought I smelled salt water, fresh, briny, impossible this far inland. Atlas barked again, pacing. Luna's ears flattened, eyes locked on the open doorway. I looked down at the journal, at the trembling ink that carried a man's final confession, and realized this wasn't the end of a mystery. It was only the beginning. Whatever truth my father had buried, it was still here. Somewhere beneath my feet. I closed the book slowly, the paper whispering like old breath, and slipped it under my arm. Outside, thunder rolled over the cliffs, distant, but coming closer. And for the first time since I'd stepped into this house, I wasn't afraid of the storm. Because the real storm was waiting underground. I sat alone in the hidden workshop, the journal open on the bench before me. The fire from the main room had long since died, leaving only the faint hum of the wind outside and the rhythmic drip of water from a leaky pipe overhead. My hands trembled as I turned the pages, the thin paper crackling beneath my fingertips. Each line I read pulled me deeper into a world I thought I had buried long ago, a world where my father was no longer the cold man I remembered, but something far more human and far more broken. The early entries were routine, written in his careful block letters: ship repairs, supply lists, weather notes. But as the months passed, his writing changed. The lines grew uneven. The words blurred and slanted, as if his hand had grown too tired to hold the pen steady. The tone shifted to less about the sea, more about me. He wrote of my mother, of the day she died, and of how he had tried to fill the silence she left behind with work. He wrote of the storm the night before I left, how he wanted to stop me, but pride wouldn't let him. Then came the words that froze me, where Saturday I sold the boat to pay off his debt. He never knew. I took the blame so his name would stay clean. I read it again slowly this time. My throat tightened. His debt, my debt. I remembered the fight we had, the night I took money that wasn't mine to fix a mistake that wasn't worth fixing. He never confronted me about it. He just looked at me with that hard silence, the one that made me feel like I didn't exist. I thought he hated me for it. I thought that was why he shut me out. But he hadn't hated me. He'd protected me. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. I kept reading, desperate, now afraid to stop. He wrote about the years after I left, the loneliness, the guilt, the way he kept the light burning by the window every night, hoping I would see it and come home. The final entry was dated only 2 weeks before he died. The ink had bled slightly, like it was written with shaking hands. If you ever come back, finish the box for me. It's not a gift. It's a confession. Everything I couldn't say is inside. My eyes drifted to the small walnut box I had found earlier, sitting quietly on the table. I hadn't noticed before, but along the bottom edge, faintly carved into the wood, were 2 words: for her. I opened it again, and this time, beneath the letter I had already read, I found a photograph folded into quarters. My mother stood on the pier, smiling with the sea behind her. My father was beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, his eyes soft, so unlike the man I remembered. And behind them, barely visible in the corner of the frame, was me, a child holding a small toy boat, grinning at something out of view. The box wasn't for me. It was for her. And he had never finished it because she had died before he could. I don't remember when the tears started, only that the first one hit the photograph and blurred my mother's smile. I tried to wipe it away, but it only smudged further. Atlas whined from the doorway, and Luna crept closer, resting her head on my knee. I let the journal fall shut and leaned forward, my forehead against the wood. For the first time in years, I cried, not for the man I'd lost, but for the years we had wasted building walls neither of us knew how to tear down. All those nights I'd cursed his silence. It had been love hiding behind it. Love shaped like guilt, like fear, like stubborn pride. He hadn't been punishing me. He'd been protecting me the only way he knew how. The workshop felt alive around me. The tools, the smell of pine, the quiet hum of the wind, they weren't just remnants of his life. They were his way of speaking after he was gone. Every cut of the blade, every piece of sanded wood was his language. I had just never learned to listen. I picked up the photograph again, running my thumb over the edges until the paper felt soft. For a long moment I sat there in the half-dark, surrounded by the ghosts of everything we never said. And somewhere deep inside the walls, a beam creaked, not like the house was settling, but like it was sighing. I thought I had come here to bury the past, but the truth was, the past had been waiting to be heard. When I finally stood, I looked around the room one last time. The box sat open, unfinished the way he had left it. I reached for a chisel still resting on the workbench and set it in place. My father had carved the word "for." Maybe it was time I carved the rest. The night after I found the letter, sleep didn't come. The air in the workshop was still heavy with the scent of pine and oil, as if time itself refused to move forward. I sat by the table, the chisel still where I'd left it, and the half-finished box waiting under the glow of the single lamp. Atlas and Luna slept near the doorway, their slow breathing the only proof that life still pulsed in this house. Outside, the wind had died. The waves no longer pounded the cliffs, they whispered soft and rhythmic like someone breathing in the dark. I thought of my father then, of the man I had spent half my life resenting. Every word I'd read from his journal replayed in my mind until the silence became unbearable. He hadn't been the villain I'd made him out to be. He'd been a man drowning in guilt, who built walls out of wood because he couldn't build bridges with words. I looked at the chisel, at the unfinished curve of the carving that spelled "for her." My hands were rough now, scarred from years of war and work, but as I picked up the tool they trembled like a boy's. I set the chisel against the grain, took a slow breath, and pressed down. The sound it made, the soft scrape of steel against wood, was strangely comforting. Every stroke felt like a confession. Every curl of wood, a word I had never said. I didn't know exactly what I was making, whether it was a box for her or for him or for me, but I knew it had to be finished. Maybe that was what forgiveness really was, not an act, but a continuation of something left undone. Hours passed unnoticed. The dogs stirred once in a while, lifting their heads before settling again. The lamp burned low. When dawn finally began to slip through the cracked window, I saw what I'd made. The box gleamed faintly in the weak light, smooth, complete, alive. Along the top I'd finished the inscription my father had started. Beneath the words, "For her," I carved 3 more. And for him, the grain caught the sunlight, and for a moment it looked as if the wood itself was breathing. I ran my hand across its surface, feeling the warmth from where my palm had rested. I realized then that I didn't just forgive him. I understood him. The silence that once haunted me had become something else, a space to listen to, remember, to rebuild. I opened the window. The morning wind rushed in, cool and briny, carrying the smell of salt and cedar. Atlas rose first, tail wagging slowly, and Luna padded over to rest her chin on my knee. Their eyes were bright, alert, waiting for a command that never came. They didn't need one. We all knew what came next. I carried the box outside. The sky was pale blue, streaked with pink, the kind of fragile color that only exists at the edge of day. Down by the cliff, where the grass met the stone, I knelt and placed the box on the ground. The urn still sat where I'd left it, small and unassuming, as if it had been waiting for this. I placed the urn beside the box and bowed my head. I didn't say much. Words had never worked for us anyway. Instead, I let the sea speak. The waves broke below, steady, endless. The wind carried a faint whistle through the reeds. Somewhere far off, a gull cried out. For a long time I stayed there watching the horizon. The sun climbed higher, spilling light across the water. It felt like the first sunrise I'd actually noticed in years. Not just seen, but noticed. When I finally rose, I didn't feel lighter. Not exactly. Grief doesn't leave. It simply settles into something bearable. But I did feel something else, something quieter and stronger. A sense that maybe the past wasn't an anchor anymore. Maybe it was a foundation. Back in the house, the light had changed. It poured through the windows, now warm and golden, catching the dust motes as they drifted through the air. The place no longer felt haunted. It felt awake. I spent the next few days cleaning what was left of the workshop. The dogs followed me everywhere, their presence grounding me in the rhythm of small things, fetching tools, sweeping sawdust, oiling hinges that had rusted stiff. I repaired the stairs, fixed the broken latch on the basement door, replaced a few shattered window panes. The house had been a tomb when I arrived, but with every nail, every brushstroke of varnish, it began to feel like something else entirely, a heartbeat returning. One evening, as the last light faded, I found myself by the fireplace again. The photograph from the box sat on the mantel, now framed between the urn and a small candle. I stared at it for a long time. My mother's smile, my father's arm around her shoulder, the boy between them grinning at something beyond the camera's reach. I realized I had spent years running from that boy, from who I was, before the noise, before the anger, before I mistook silence for hatred. Somewhere between the wars I fought abroad and the one I carried inside, I'd forgotten what home was supposed to mean. Now I knew. Home wasn't a place free from ghosts. It was a place where ghosts could rest. Atlas shifted beside the fire, letting out a contented sigh. Luna stretched and leaned against my leg. I reached down to scratch her behind the ears, and she nuzzled closer, her fur warm against my hand. We stayed like that for a while, the three of us watching the fire burn low. I thought about leaving again, about selling the place, and starting over somewhere else. But the thought didn't last long. The truth was, I'd already started over right here in the ashes of what I thought I'd lost. Later that night I stepped outside one last time. The moon was rising over the sea, casting a silver path across the waves. The air smelled of pine and salt, and something new, something alive. I walked to the edge of the cliff and looked down at the dark water below. The tide was calm, the surface smooth as glass. For years I'd imagined the ocean as something that took things away. Now it felt like something that returned them. I took a deep breath and whispered a quiet goodbye. Not to him, not to her, but to the version of myself that couldn't forgive. The wind caught my voice and carried it out over the sea until it disappeared. When I turned back toward the house, the windows glowed softly, the fire inside flickering against the glass. It looked warm, alive, waiting. Atlas barked once, short and bright, as if to remind me that it was time to come in. Luna trotted ahead of me, her tail swaying like a banner. I followed them up the path, feeling the earth solid beneath my boots. The stars above shimmered through the thinning clouds, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel lost beneath them. I opened the door. The warmth of the fire met me like a living thing. The dog settled by the hearth again. I hung my coat on the old rack by the door, his rack, and turned toward the workbench one more time. The box sat there in the center of the table, complete and polished. I placed my hand over it, not to claim it, but to honor it. It wasn't his anymore. It wasn't mine either. It was both of ours, a bridge across all the silence. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. Not the peace of forgetting, but the peace of understanding. Outside, the wind began to rise again, but it no longer sounded like a lament. It sounded like breath, like life. I whispered softly into the quiet, not expecting an answer. We're home now. Morning came quietly, as if the world itself had taken a deep breath and finally exhaled. The storm had passed. The sea below shimmered under the first rays of light, calm and endless, and the house behind me stood still, a witness, no longer a tomb. I poured myself a cup of coffee, sat on the old porch, and watched Atlas chase the gulls, while Luna lay stretched in the sun, her fur glowing silver in the daylight. For the first time in years, the silence didn't hurt. It healed. Everything my father had left behind, the journal, the workshop, the box, had stopped being reminders of pain. They had become proof that love doesn't vanish just because people do. It hides in the work they leave unfinished, in the things they build, hoping someone else will understand someday. Maybe forgiveness isn't something you give. Maybe it's something you uncover, layer by layer, until it starts breathing again. As the light climbed higher, I caught sight of the waves breaking against the cliffs. In their rhythm, I heard something that almost felt like a heartbeat. A pulse, older than the house, older than the guilt, older than me. I realized then that stories like mine don't really end. They just circle back, waiting for someone else to listen, to pick up the thread, to open the next door. I looked at the horizon one last time before heading back inside. The box sat on the mantel, now catching the sunlight, gleaming faintly, like it had its own quiet life. I thought about how strange it was that sometimes to move forward, you have to walk straight into the past. And maybe that's why I came back. Not to bury ghosts, but to understand them. Because the past doesn't die. It waits. And when you finally find the courage to face it, it gives you something in return. Truth, peace, maybe even redemption. I don't know what comes next. There are still pages left in my father's journal that I haven't read. Coordinates, drawings, a line about something buried deeper beneath the house. A message, perhaps, or a secret meant for someone who could handle it. Maybe that someone is me. Or maybe it's you watching this, wondering what waits under your own floorboards. So tell me, if you found a letter from someone you thought you understood, and it changed everything you believed about them, would you open it? Or would you leave it sealed, afraid of what you might find? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear your stories, your ghosts, the silences you've learned to live with. And if this story spoke to you, if it made you remember someone you once walked away from, don't let it stop here. There's more to uncover. The truth buried in this house isn't done revealing itself, because somewhere beyond this chapter, another door waits in the dark, and I think I'm finally ready to open it. Stay with me. The next story begins where this one ends.